The morning the Carver house was declared abandoned, the air in Warren County carried the heavy scent of early autumn hay and something else quieter but far more unsettling. No one noticed it at first. The cornfields still rustled. The windmill still creaked on the old farmstead. The mail still dropped through the slot at the foot of the wooden porch. But by the end of that September week in 2003, something unmistakable had begun to settle over the Carver place. Silence. Too much of it. On the edge of town, people began to ask questions they had avoided for days. Had anyone heard from Mark Carver or his wife Beth since last Friday? Had their 3 kids missed Sunday school for the first time in years? Had the dogs stopped barking? It was Ethan Carver, Mark's younger brother, who finally drove out to the property after work that Thursday evening. He found the farmhouse locked and the porch light still flickering against the dusk like a question no one wanted to answer. Inside, there were no signs of struggle. The dining room table had 4 plates laid out neatly with silverware. A Bible sat open to the Book of Psalms. The family calendar on the wall had a scribbled note, weekend trip to the lake house. Back Monday. Feed dogs. The note seemed innocuous until Ethan walked out back and found both the shepherd and the hound lying silent in their kennels, long since dead from neglect. The food bowls were untouched. Whatever plan the Carvers had made, it was clear they never came back to honor it. The sheriff at the time was George Reddick, a man known for long pauses and short investigations. He took Ethan's statement, walked the perimeter of the property, and by the end of the following week declared the Carvers a case of voluntary disappearance. No broken locks, no blood, no evidence of forced entry. No reason to pursue further. Ethan pushed, but Reddick reminded him that adults had the right to leave if they chose. It did not matter that Mark would never leave the animals unfed. It did not matter that Beth's parents never heard about any lake house. The file was closed by the end of the month. Ethan had never really stopped searching, even if he never said it out loud. He kept Mark's land in order, cut the grass when it threatened to swallow the porch, and stored the unpaid property taxes in a drawer, along with old photos and unpaid bills. He returned every few months to clean up the place, each time hoping to find some sign that they had simply moved, started over, left a message no one had yet found. He married in 2009, had a daughter in 2011, divorced in 2016, and each of those milestones reminded him that his brother had missed it all. The questions never stopped pressing. Where did they go? Why no word? Why no trace? By the fall of 2020, the world was already strained by different types of silence. People stayed home. Towns grew quieter. Ethan, now 37, found himself more reflective than usual. He drove out to the old farmhouse on a cool Saturday morning, not for a reason he could define, just something pulling at his ribs. The grass had grown high again. A rusted truck still sat in the barn untouched. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside, noting the same air of stillness that had never lifted since that first day. Dust covered every surface like a blanket meant to keep memory warm, but hidden. In the hallway, he noticed something new. The floorboard near the coat rack had warped from a recent leak in the roof. When he stepped on it, the board sank with a soft groan. He knelt, pried it open with a crowbar from the garage, and found a stack of water-damaged books, some of Mark's journals, and under that, something folded tight like a forgotten secret. It was a torn section of a county planning map, edges burned, slightly water-stained but legible. A bold, red circle looped over the Carver property. Next to it in ink that had not faded was the word "priority" written in capital letters. The map had no name, no author, and no date, but something about it chilled Ethan more than the cold wind through the broken kitchen window. He had grown up hearing whispers about land grabs, zoning battles, and developers trying to buy up farmland for interstate expansions. Mark had always refused to sell. The family land meant more than money. The red circle felt like a warning not meant to be found. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it back, placed it in his glove compartment, and stood at the edge of the field where his brother used to walk every morning. The next day, he went to town to visit the county clerk's office. He asked for property development records from 2001 to 2004. The woman behind the glass told him those files were not digitized, and most of the paper records were moved to off-site storage after the 2005 flood. She did, however, find one permit application dated July 2003. It was unsigned, denied, and marked with the words "Reconsider" in red ink. The applicant was listed as Midlands Development Group, LLC. The parcel they wanted to build on matched the coordinates of the Carver land. That night, Ethan barely slept. He turned over memory after memory. Mark once mentioned people stopping by offering to buy the farm strangers who did not take no for an answer. Back then, Ethan had thought little of it. Now, the red circle made every vague recollection feel urgent. He remembered something else, too. A week before the Carvers vanished, a man in a sheriff's uniform had shown up at Ethan's shop asking about boundary lines, water access, and something about easements. At the time, it had felt routine. Now it felt different. Ethan called the new sheriff's department and asked about any records regarding Midlands Development Group. The receptionist took his number but never called back. He searched online but found only a trace of the company name buried in old zoning meeting minutes from 2002. He printed what he could and stared at it long into the night. 17 years, and this was the first concrete lead he had. A torn map, a circle in red, a forgotten permit, and a silence far too heavy for a family known for Sunday dinners and backyard laughter. By the time the week ended, Ethan had already made his decision. He would dig again. Not into the ground, but into memory records, conversations, whatever it took. Something had happened in 2003. Something big enough to make an entire family vanish without a single goodbye. And now the silence had lasted long enough. Ethan returned to the Carver farmhouse a week after finding the torn map. The weather had turned colder, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and dry leaves. He pulled his truck to the side of the old gravel drive, stepping out slowly with a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope tucked under his arm. Inside the envelope were the few documents he had gathered so far, including the printout of the denied development permit and a photocopy of the torn map. He did not know what he was looking for on this visit. Something instinctive had pulled him here again. He walked around the house, noting that the porch steps had rotted further and one of the windows was cracked. The place had always felt like it was waiting for someone to come home. Today, it felt like it was waiting for a witness. He checked the barn first, mostly out of habit. The doors groaned as they opened, revealing the same cluttered interior that had not changed in years. As he moved past the old workbench and stacked crates, something caught his attention near the loft ladder. A thick folder had been tucked behind a loose beam. It was sealed in a plastic grocery bag and labeled with faded ink. Inside, Ethan found old mail addressed to Mark Carver, postmarked weeks after the disappearance. The envelopes were never opened. A utility bill, a letter from a farm supply co-op. But what startled Ethan most was a yellow delivery notice from the United States Postal Service marked undeliverable and returned to sender. The return address was local. That was odd. Someone had been trying to reach the Carvers after they disappeared, and the postal system had routed the mail back to a nearby source. The next day, Ethan drove to the post office in Warren County and asked to speak with someone who might remember mail routes from 17 years ago. The current staff was polite but shrugged. Most of them had only been hired in the last decade. Eventually, a manager suggested he speak to Marvin Capps, the retired rural carrier who had worked that route during the early 2000s. They gave Ethan an address on the west side of town near the creek. He found the house tucked beneath a row of sycamores, the yard scattered with wind chimes and faded garden tools. Marvin answered the door slowly, his frame stooped, but his eyes sharp. He remembered Ethan right away and invited him in for tea. After some pleasantries, Ethan brought up the Carvers. Marvin grew quiet. Marvin sat on a worn recliner, tapping his fingers against his teacup. He said he never forgot that week in 2003. Something about it always bothered him. He recalled delivering mail on the Friday before the Carvers vanished. Mark had waved from the porch, same as always. Marvin dropped off a few envelopes and remembered seeing a county cruiser parked along the tree line near the road. The man behind the wheel was wearing a sheriff's uniform, but Marvin had never seen him before. He thought maybe it was someone new on the force. The officer had gotten out briefly and walked to the front gate, then disappeared around the side of the house. Marvin assumed it was routine business. He thought little of it at the time. But the next week, when no mail was picked up and no one answered the door, Marvin began to worry. He had mentioned it to his supervisor, but the sheriff's office assured them it was a voluntary family departure. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He asked Marvin if he remembered what the officer looked like. Marvin shook his head but then paused. He did recall one detail. The car had government plates but no department number stenciled on the rear bumper. That had struck him as odd. He also remembered a sticker on the dash that read "Temporary Assignment." Marvin offered to sign a statement if Ethan needed it. Ethan thanked him, shook his hand, and left with a mind swirling in fragments. A sheriff's deputy no one recognized. A cruiser without proper markings. Mail delivered but never picked up. And a government vehicle assigned temporarily to rural Missouri with no follow-up. Later that evening, Ethan went back to the farmhouse and sat in the front room, where the light slanted across the floorboards. He reviewed Marvin's story again, piecing it together with what he knew. If the cruiser was not from Warren County, then maybe someone from another department had been assigned there temporarily. He would have to check county records. As the sun lowered behind the trees, he walked the perimeter of the house again. Something about the back shed drew his attention. It had always been locked. He had assumed it was just storage, but the padlock was newer than the others. He broke it open with a crowbar and pushed the door inward. Inside the shed was mostly empty. Just a few boxes of fertilizer-broken tools and a stack of unused shingles. But in the far corner beneath a plastic tarp, Ethan uncovered something unexpected. An old tarp bundled tightly around a small wooden crate. The crate had rope handles and a metal latch. When he opened it, he found dog collars inside, 2 of them. One was engraved with the name Scout, the other with Daisy. The tags had police department numbers etched faintly on the back. Ethan turned them over in his hands, then looked toward the kennel. He had buried both dogs years ago after finding them dead behind the barn. But he never remembered them wearing tags like these. Certainly not with government identifiers. He took photographs of everything and stored the crate in his truck. That night, Ethan searched through animal control records from the county archives. There were no reports filed about Carver property animals in 2003, but he did find something strange. A requisition form from the sheriff's office dated 3 days after the Carvers vanished, requesting new canine tags and collars from a vendor in Illinois. The form was signed by someone whose name Ethan had never heard before. Randall Pierce. The signature looked rushed and unfamiliar. The title next to it said Special Deputy Liaison. Ethan called a contact at the county clerk's office and asked about Randall Pierce. No record of employment under that name came up in the sheriff's department between 2000 and 2005. He asked if anyone had ever served as a liaison for rural land use or development. The clerk said not officially, but there had been task forces related to agricultural transition grants in the early 2000s. She offered to send what little documentation they had. Ethan gave her his address, thanked her, and ended the call. His gut told him he had found a ghost in the records. Someone who passed through quietly made just enough noise to leave confusion, then vanished like the Carvers. He went back to the crate and inspected the interior more carefully. Beneath the collars was a folded piece of wax paper. Inside the fold were 3 photographs, one of Mark standing near the barn, one of Beth in the garden with the children, and one of a white truck parked at the end of their gravel road with its license plate half visible. The photos had timestamps, all from the day before the disappearance. Ethan stared at the truck. He remembered it. That truck had been parked in front of the town courthouse in 2002. The man inside had tried to buy land from half the town. On the first Sunday of October, Ethan returned to the old farmhouse with a single goal. For years, the family had avoided formal memorials, clinging to the faint hope that the Carvers would return. But after what he had uncovered in recent weeks, Ethan could no longer pretend. He decided to hold a small remembrance gathering, not a funeral, but something quiet and honest. He reached out to Cousin's former neighbors and a few old friends who had known Mark and Beth well. The turnout was modest but sincere. Folding chairs were set up in a semicircle near the back pasture, facing the old oak tree where the Carver children used to play. A table near the house displayed a few photos, a worn Bible, and a quilt Beth had made during the last winter anyone saw her. Ethan stood before the group not to give a speech but to invite memory. People began to share stories. A cousin recalled how Mark helped him rebuild a collapsed fence one spring. A neighbor talked about the pies Beth would bring to church potlucks. A retired teacher from the local elementary school spoke about the quiet brilliance of Abby Carver, the eldest daughter. As the morning sun climbed higher, something strange happened. The silence that had haunted the farm for 17 years began to shift. It did not disappear, but it softened. The pain was still there, but it had shape now, not just mystery. After the gathering ended and the guests returned to their cars, Ethan stayed behind to clean up. He collected the folding chairs and stacked them neatly under the porch. As he was gathering the last few paper cups from the table, he noticed an old photo album that had not been there earlier. It sat near the edge of the table, dusty and yellowed. Someone must have brought it during the gathering. He opened it slowly. Inside were Polaroids from the late 90s pages of the Carvers smiling during holidays and birthdays. On the final page was a photograph Ethan had never seen before. It showed the Carver family standing on the porch, all 5 members framed by the setting sun. The date in the corner matched the week before their disappearance. Ethan examined the photo more closely. Behind the family, barely visible through the glass window of the front door, was a faint silhouette. The shape was not familiar. It looked like a man standing just inside the house. His outline was indistinct, but the figure seemed to wear something on his chest, possibly a badge or radio. Ethan scanned the image for other details. The time of day was early evening. The children were smiling. Mark had his arm around Beth. But something about the man in the window made Ethan's skin crawl. He flipped the photo over, hoping for a name or note, but there was only the faded imprint of a brand logo from a drugstore that had closed over a decade ago. The next day, Ethan took the photo to a retired photo technician who used to work in town. The man agreed to enhance the image using software he had kept for his hobby. After a few minutes of processing, the figure in the doorway became slightly clearer. The man was definitely wearing a law enforcement-style radio harness, and his face, though grainy, had a sharp jaw and close-cropped hair. Ethan did not recognize him, but something about the stance, the authority in it, was unmistakable. Whoever he was inside the house moments before that family photo was taken. Ethan drove back to the farmhouse and sat on the porch with the album. He opened to the last page again and studied every detail. That is when he noticed the laundry line in the background. A row of freshly washed clothes hung from the posts, gently swaying in the breeze. At first it meant nothing, but then Ethan remembered a conversation he had overheard once between Beth and his late mother. Beth had always done laundry in the afternoons, never late in the day. She believed clothes left out overnight attracted insects and mildew. The timing did not make sense. The family had supposedly left for a weekend trip the next morning. Why would Beth do laundry at sunset the night before if they were going away for days? That detail lingered in Ethan's mind as he walked to the back of the property. The laundry poles were still standing, though the wire had rusted. He imagined the scene from the photo. The family lined up on the porch, the sun behind them, fresh laundry flapping behind the photographer. He returned to the album, scanning the clothes more carefully. Among the dark jeans and flannel shirts was something that broke the pattern: a neon yellow-green vest, bright, jarring, unnatural in the quiet earth tones of the rest of the clothing. Ethan leaned closer. The vest had reflective stripes and a faded patch that read "County Operations." His breath caught. It was not farm gear. It was a safety vest issued to county officials or law enforcement. It should not have been there. He ran to the shed where he had found the crate and dog collars. He opened it again, rummaging through the items. Nothing inside matched the vest. He called the sheriff's department asking if any records remained of deputies assigned to rural outreach in 2003. They told him those files were sealed or purged after 5 years. He asked for names, even unofficial ones. The receptionist said she would get back to him. She never did. That night, Ethan took the photo and scanned it into his computer. He enlarged the section with the vest and sent it to a friend who worked in supply logistics for the county road department. She responded within hours. That vest was part of a special order made in early 2003, issued only to field agents working on land acquisition reviews. The records listed 6 names. One of them was Randall Pierce. Ethan searched again for Randall Pierce. He found no public records, no social media, no photographs. But in an old county meeting transcript from April 2003, a note appeared next to a zoning change proposal. Comments reviewed by Liaison R. Pierce. That same proposal included properties adjacent to the Carver farm. The name had been there all along, hidden in meeting minutes and requisition slips. Later that week, Ethan visited his aunt in town, who had not been to the farm in years. She had been close to Beth and had declined the memorial out of grief. Over tea, Ethan showed her the porch photo. She wept quietly, then stopped. She pointed to something in the lower corner of the image. A child's tricycle, half hidden by the porch steps. It had not been there before the week of the disappearance. Beth had told her they kept the tricycle in the barn during the summer. Someone had moved it. The details piled up. The laundry, the vest, the unknown man in the doorway. The tricycle. Ethan began to realize the truth had always been visible. It was just waiting for someone to look long enough. The October wind came sharp that morning as Ethan parked behind the Warren County Registry office. He walked through the front doors carrying the photo album and a folder of notes. The front clerk, an older woman named Denise, greeted him by name and led him to the archive room where public records from the past 4 decades were stored. Ethan had called ahead and asked for access to zoning and development permits filed in the early 2000s. Denise unlocked the metal drawer cabinets and left him with a stack of boxes. The light above the table flickered slightly as he pulled the first folder from the stack and began reading. Many of the documents were ordinary. Zoning changes for trailer parks, road widening permits, maintenance contracts for county-owned farmland. But as he sorted through a manila folder marked August 2003, he found something that did not belong. It was a copy of a county development map with torn edges nearly identical to the one he had discovered in Mark's barn weeks earlier. The same red circle marked over the Carver land. But this time, there was a faint stamp at the bottom right corner. It read Midlands Development Group. Below it, a partially erased signature line held the name Pierce. It was barely legible, but it matched the name he had found in the county meeting transcript, R. Pierce. This version of the map had additional markings. Parcel boundaries had been redrawn, and several other nearby farms were labeled in different colors, possibly indicating ownership changes. Ethan snapped photos of every page with his phone and slid the papers back into the folder. He checked the county clerk index and found an address linked to the Midlands Development Group. It was no longer active under that name. The business had dissolved in 2008, but a cross-reference search led him to a rebranded company called Horizon Development Partners, operating out of St. Charles. He copied the address and left the office with a growing sense that every document he found was pulling him closer to something hidden in plain sight. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the Carver house. He spread the two maps on the dining room table side by side. The one he had found in the barn was more weathered, possibly older, but the markings aligned perfectly. What stood out now was the word priority stamped near the Carver land on both maps. It was not a planning term used by the county. It was something else, possibly an internal designation from the developer. The Carvers had been a target, not simply included in a plan, but highlighted. He called a friend from college who worked as a land use analyst in Kansas City. Her name was Natalie, and she agreed to look into Midlands Development Group and its affiliates. 2 days later, she called back with a quiet voice. She said that Midlands had been a shell company formed in 2001 with anonymous investors. It had acquired options to buy land across rural Missouri, especially areas near projected highway expansion corridors. Most of the purchases went through without resistance. Only a handful of parcels were flagged as problematic. One of them was the Carver property. Natalie emailed Ethan a scanned internal memo she had discovered through a leaked audit report from 2007. The memo was short but chilling. It read, "Carver parcel stalled. Liaison suggests alternative persuasion." The word persuasion sat heavily in Ethan's mind. He drove back into town and walked into the newspaper office of the Warren Sentinel. The editor, a man named Harold Green, had been there for over 30 years. Ethan asked if the paper had ever done a story on Midlands Development Group. Harold remembered a series from 2004 that never went to print. The reporter who wrote it had left town shortly after filing the draft. The reason Harold said was unclear. The story had centered on aggressive land acquisitions and a connection to a string of suspicious farm sales in 3 counties. Ethan asked to see the draft. Harold hesitated, but eventually printed a copy. The story listed 4 families who sold under pressure. Each one reported threats, visits from unfamiliar county officials, and vague legal consequences if they refused. One of the farmers, now deceased, had told the reporter about a man named Randall, who claimed to work with the sheriff's office but never wore a badge. The timeline matched everything Ethan had found. The Carvers had refused, the others had not. Ethan began to suspect that persuasion meant more than negotiation. It might have meant disappearance. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the story drafts and maps. His daughter Mia worked on her homework nearby. At one point, she looked up and asked who the man in the photo was. Ethan turned to see her pointing at the grainy porch photo from the memorial album. He told her it might have been a sheriff or someone pretending to be. Mia asked why someone would pretend to be a sheriff. Ethan had no answer. He turned the page and stared at a copy of the audit memo again. Alternative persuasion. What did that mean exactly in a town like Warren, where most people trusted their neighbors and avoided lawyers? The following morning, Ethan drove to the county recorder's office and requested property deed transfers for the land adjacent to the Carver property. The clerk handed him a folder filled with copies of transaction records from 2002 to 2005. Ethan scanned through them and noticed something peculiar. Several of the properties had been transferred under suspicious circumstances. One farm was signed over by a widower who had been diagnosed with dementia. Another was sold by a man who had died just a week later, with his signature barely legible. But the most disturbing detail came when Ethan reached the page listing the Carver property. According to the document, the Carvers had sold the land to Midlands Development Group in November 2003, 2 months after they vanished. The signature block was filled with perfect handwriting under Mark Carver's name. Beth Carver's name followed, written in the same exact script. A notary seal was affixed to the bottom right corner, issued by a woman named Judith Kemp. Ethan knew that name. She had been the notary at the bank in town. She had died in 2004 after a sudden illness. The paper trail looked clean, too clean. He took the documents to the bank where Judith had worked. A former co-worker confirmed that Judith had notarized very few land sales and only handled clients she knew personally. When asked about the Carver deed, she grew pale. She did not recall witnessing anything for Mark or Beth. She believed the seal had been copied. Ethan photographed the documents and left without another word. The next few days moved slowly. Ethan carried copies of the forged deed and audit memo in the glove compartment of his truck, unsure where to take them next. He drove aimlessly at times, revisiting places connected to the Carvers. The feed store, the church where Beth used to volunteer, the field where the school held harvest fairs. He hoped someone else would remember something that had seemed meaningless back then but might now carry weight. His instincts told him he had only uncovered the edge of what had been done. The paper trail hinted at planning, but the silence around the whole thing still felt deliberate, like everyone had agreed not to speak of it. Ethan believed not everyone had forgotten. Some had chosen not to remember. He started with the post office again. Denise, the same woman who had helped him weeks ago, recognized him immediately. When he showed her the forged deed and asked about any unusual mail practices during the fall of 2003, she hesitated. Then she leaned closer and asked him to wait. 10 minutes later, she returned with a sealed envelope addressed to Beth Carver. She told him it had arrived years ago but was held for verification because the return address looked suspicious. The envelope had never been opened, marked with red ink as undeliverable, and stored in a back file that was forgotten until recently. Ethan thanked her and left. Inside his truck, he carefully opened the seal. The letter inside was brief and typed. It read, "We know you never signed anything. Keep your children safe." Burn this letter. No signature followed. That night, Ethan stared at the letter under a reading lamp, its words burning into his thoughts. Someone knew. Someone had tried to warn Beth, or maybe someone had tried to frighten her. He could not tell which. He called Natalie again and asked if she could trace the postmark. She said she would try, but without a clear sender name or digital record, it might take time. Ethan hung up and stared at the farmhouse through the window. It was nearly midnight, and the shadows from the tree line stretched long against the fields. He felt watched, not by ghosts or memories, but by the weight of secrets that had stayed hidden too long. The next morning, he drove to the property next to the Carver farm. It had belonged to the Henleys, a quiet couple who had moved away after the Carvers disappeared. Their son, Graham Henley, still lived nearby and worked as a surveyor. Ethan found him in his garage packing equipment into the back of a pickup. Graham was slow to talk, but when Ethan showed him the forged deed, the old map, and the photo of the safety vest on the laundry line, something shifted in his expression. He nodded toward the house and invited Ethan in for coffee. Inside the Henley kitchen, surrounded by hunting gear and blueprints, Graham finally spoke. He remembered a day in late August 2003 when his father came back from a trip into town and said someone had offered to buy their land. The man claimed he was from a planning committee that worked with the county. He carried a binder and wore a county services badge. Graham's father refused and said he would never sell. A week later, the man returned, but this time with another person in uniform. They stood at the end of the driveway but never approached. Graham believed they were just checking again. His family never accepted the offer, and within a month, the Carvers vanished. 2 weeks after that, the Henleys received another offer, this time from a law firm representing Midlands Development. They sold under pressure when his father got sick. No one ever came back to check. Ethan asked Graham if he remembered anything about the men's vehicles or faces. Graham said the first man drove a white SUV with temporary plates and tinted windows. The second one had a tan cruiser with government tags and no clear department name. Neither of them returned after the Carvers were gone. Graham had tried to forget about it, especially after his parents moved to a retirement home out west. Ethan thanked him and promised not to involve him without permission. Graham nodded and walked him out. That evening, Ethan visited the local diner. He saw Mary Parker, an old friend of Beth's, seated by herself near the window. He sat across from her and gently began to ask questions. Mary grew nervous when he mentioned the forged documents but listened carefully. She admitted that Beth had come to her just days before the disappearance and asked whether it was safe to involve the sheriff. Beth had seemed scared, said someone kept parking outside their home late at night, and she did not trust the man who had come asking questions about the land. Mary urged her to tell the church elders, or Ethan, but Beth said she needed time. That was the last time they spoke. After leaving the diner, Ethan sat in his truck under the pale glow of the parking lot lights. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his notes. 2 vehicles, 1 message. A town that had looked the other way. He returned home and opened the box of documents again. He sorted through the county permits, the transcript notes, and the fraudulent deed. At the bottom of the stack was a folded sheet from the audit Natalie had sent. It listed bank transfers made by Midland's Development Group. Most were ordinary real estate transactions. But one entry stood out. A payment marked consulting fee made to an account under the name Randall P. 2 weeks after the Carvers vanished. Ethan called Natalie again. She dug deeper and confirmed the account had been closed in 2004 and the bank it had been linked to no longer existed. But she found one more note. A wire transfer receipt showed the account had received monthly deposits from Horizon Development Partners for almost 6 months after the fee was paid. Each payment was small enough to avoid triggering banking audits. Each came from a different office location. Someone had been keeping Randall hidden or paid off. Maybe both. Ethan waited 2 more days before his next step. He drove slowly through the familiar 2-lane roads that curved through Warren County, his thoughts churning with every turn of the tires. At the center of everything remained one unanswered question. How had Randall Pierce, whoever he was, operated with such boldness under the nose of local law enforcement without being flagged or investigated? Ethan kept coming back to Sheriff George Reddick, the man who had closed the case in 2003 after only a few days. Reddick had retired in 2007 and died in 2011, but the way he dismissed the case had always seemed off even back then. It was time to see if Reddick had left anything behind. Ethan reached out to Hannah Reddick, the late sheriff's daughter, who now worked as a paralegal in Jefferson City. She agreed to meet him at her father's old house, which she had been preparing to sell. They sat at the kitchen table surrounded by boxes of files and newspaper clippings from her father's career. Ethan explained what he had discovered so far, careful not to accuse, only to present what the paper trail had shown. Hannah listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she stood and walked to a small wooden cabinet near the fireplace. She opened the drawer and pulled out a thick brown leather-bound ledger. She handed it to Ethan and said she had always thought it was just a list of campaign donors and sheriff's department contacts. She never had reason to read through it carefully. Ethan opened the ledger and scanned the first few pages. The handwriting was neat, dated entries arranged chronologically. Most of it seemed mundane. Notes on meetings, patrol schedules, names of local business owners. But by the middle of the book, in a section marked Summer 2003, things began to shift. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he read lines about land evaluation, zoning threats, and external inquiries. One entry stood out. July 14, 2003. Met with R. Pierce and J. Marlin. Discussed parcels of interest near Route 12. Carver land flagged as critical. Concerns over non-compliance. Alternative steps suggested. No law enforcement involvement unless necessary. Ethan turned the page and found more names. Some were familiar from past county board meetings. One caught his attention. G. Trumbull, a former planning commissioner who had moved to Tennessee in 2005 under quiet circumstances. There were other references to outside consultants and a group listed only as partners. The entries were vague, as if Sheriff Reddick had deliberately avoided including full details. Still, the pattern was clear. Reddick had been aware of the pressure on landowners and possibly complicit in decisions that allowed unmarked personnel to visit properties. Ethan photographed every page, then carefully closed the book. Before leaving, Hannah told him something else. After her father passed, she had found a small lockbox in the attic with old keys and a handful of cassette tapes labeled only by dates. She had never listened to them. She brought the box down and handed it to Ethan, saying she felt something about the timing of everything had never felt right. Ethan thanked her and left quietly. Back at home, Ethan found an old cassette player and inserted the first tape. The audio crackled, but voices slowly emerged. The first tape was dated August 3, 2003. The voice of Sheriff Reddick was clear. He was speaking to someone else, likely a deputy. The conversation centered around legal pressure and how far the department should go in assisting land use consultants. Reddick mentioned the Carvers by name, said they were stubborn, said the liaison had already visited them twice. Then he said something chilling. If they do not bend, they might break. And we do not stop the fall. Ethan stopped the tape and sat back in silence. He knew what he had heard. There were 4 more tapes in the box. He listened to each one. They revealed backroom meetings, denials of enforcement requests, and multiple references to outside interests providing funding for re-election campaigns and equipment donations. Reddick had shielded more than just Midland's development. He had enabled a system where disappearing a family was seen as a manageable consequence. Ethan made digital copies of the recordings and stored them on multiple drives. He knew this was no longer just a case of lost family members. It had grown into something far more calculated. The next morning, Ethan visited the county records room again. This time, he requested internal memos from the sheriff's office communications from 2002 to 2004. He was told many of the files were no longer stored in the county facility. Some had been archived off-site, others shredded after retention policies expired. Ethan asked if the sheriff's department had received any equipment donations during that period. The records technician confirmed 2 items: a mobile command trailer and a surveillance system, both listed under anonymous donation. The paperwork showed initials RP listed as the procurement agent. Ethan left the building with the name Randall Pierce louder than ever in his mind. He drove to the office of the district attorney and requested an appointment. The receptionist said there was no availability until the following week. Ethan handed over a printed copy of one tape's transcript and asked her to flag it as urgent. That evening, he received a voicemail asking him to return the next day. He arrived early and was shown into a private room where Assistant DA Karen Hoyt met him. He explained everything from the forged documents to the ledger to the recordings. She listened without interrupting, asked for his copies, and requested the names of everyone who had spoken with him. Ethan gave her everything. She said a case this old would require careful coordination with state investigators, but the evidence warranted immediate attention. She promised to initiate contact with the Attorney General's office within 48 hours. That night, Ethan returned to the farmhouse. He stood on the back porch and looked toward the tree line. The land felt different now. Not quieter, but more awake. He understood now that silence had not been natural. It had been maintained, controlled, bought, and enforced. He walked through the grass with a flashlight and stopped near the edge of the barn. In the dirt, beneath a pile of broken fence rails, something caught his eye. A rusted lock. He lifted it and uncovered a section of floor panel that had not been visible before. Beneath it, stairs descended into darkness. Ethan stood at the edge of the barn, staring into the small square opening he had uncovered beneath the pile of broken fence rails. The wood around the opening was old and weather-worn, but the floor panel that had covered it was newer. Someone had placed it there intentionally. He knelt down and aimed his flashlight into the hole. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, built from unfinished lumber that looked slightly warped but intact. Dust floated in the beam of light as if it had not been disturbed in years. The air rising from the space below smelled stale, mixed with the faint scent of mold and something harder to define. Ethan hesitated only briefly before stepping onto the top stair. The boards creaked under his weight but held. The descent took less than a minute. At the bottom, the flashlight revealed a small room no larger than a tool shed. The walls were made of poured concrete and the floor was compacted earth. Along one side of the room sat a row of metal shelves holding old paint cans, ropes, and what appeared to be tools for fence repair. Ethan scanned the rest of the room and noticed a wooden chest pushed into the far corner. He crossed the room slowly, every step stirring a soft crunch of gravel and dirt. He crouched beside the chest and lifted the lid. Inside were folded blankets, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a faded, leather-bound book. Beneath the book, tucked in a sealed bag, was a collection of documents that looked more official than anything else in the room. Ethan opened the bag and pulled out the papers one by one. The first was a handwritten letter addressed to no one. It was written in Beth Carver's careful script. The date in the top corner read September 3, 2003. The letter described being approached by men in plain clothes who asked to speak with Mark about selling the property. When Mark refused, they returned the following day with someone dressed like a county officer. They did not provide identification and never gave names. Beth wrote that she felt unsafe and believed the family was being watched. The final lines of the letter mentioned that she and Mark had considered hiding for a few days if things got worse. Ethan folded the paper gently and placed it back in the bag. The next few pages included copies of medical records for the children vaccination cards and a list of emergency contacts. It looked like Beth had gathered what she could in case the family needed to leave suddenly. Ethan turned to the leather-bound book. It was a diary belonging to Beth with entries starting in July 2003 and ending abruptly in early September. The final entry read, "We are no longer alone on this land. They walk the ridge at night with flashlights. They leave tire tracks in the back pasture. I saw one of them near the barn, but he disappeared before Mark got outside. I do not think the sheriff will help us. He knows already." Ethan sat back against the concrete wall and let the words settle. He felt a hollow ache in his chest. Beth had tried to protect her family. She had known they were being hunted and had no one to turn to. He gathered everything carefully, returned to the surface, and secured the opening with the panel again. By the time he locked the barn and returned to the house, the sun had nearly set. He sat at the kitchen table, laid out the documents, and stared at the letter again. A cold sense of clarity had begun to form. The Carvers had not simply vanished. They had been cornered, threatened, and likely forced to run or hide. But if they had fled, where had they gone? There had been no bank activity, no calls, no sightings. He thought of the ridge Beth had mentioned in her final diary entry. The next morning, Ethan walked behind the barn toward the ridge that bordered the rear pasture. The ground sloped gradually upward, lined with cottonwoods and wild grass that had grown tall from years of neglect. At the top, he found a narrow footpath half buried in fallen leaves. It curved around the back edge of the ridge where the trees grew dense. He followed it until it opened into a small clearing he had never seen before. In the middle of the clearing stood an old hunting blind elevated on wooden stilts, weathered and half collapsed. Nearby, hidden among tall weeds, was the outline of something more permanent. A root cellar door partially buried and covered in pine needles. Ethan cleared the entrance and pulled it open. A rush of cold air escaped from the darkness below. He aimed his flashlight inside and saw stone walls, shelves, and the glint of something metallic on the floor. He descended the few steps cautiously. The space was larger than it appeared from the outside. Along the walls were mason jars of canned food, long spoiled, an old lantern, and a rusted cot. In the center of the floor lay a blanket, a pair of children's shoes, and an empty water jug. He stood silently, taking in every object. This place had been used, possibly as a hiding spot, possibly as a last refuge. He picked up the shoes. One had a name written inside in permanent marker. Abby, the eldest Carver daughter. The shoes were worn dirt, still embedded in the soles. Ethan looked toward the far wall where a small satchel rested beneath a broken shelf. Inside were 2 photographs, one of the Carver children playing in the yard. The other was a blurry image of 2 men standing near the barn. It had been taken from a distance, the angle slightly tilted, as if the person holding the camera had been trying not to be seen. Ethan flipped the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Ridge Watchers, September 2nd. Ethan stepped outside, heart pounding. He had found the last trace of the Carvers. Not a grave, not a message, but a moment frozen in time. Someone had hidden here. Maybe the whole family, maybe just the children. He did not know for how long. The presence of the photos suggested they had been watched even while in hiding. He scanned the tree line again and thought about the people Beth had seen walking the ridge. Whoever they were, they had not stopped watching even after the Carvers disappeared. Ethan stood outside the root cellar for several minutes with the 2 photographs still in his hand. The wind carried the brittle smell of pine and soil as he looked once more at the image of the 2 men near the barn. He could not identify either face, but the posture of one man felt familiar. Square shoulders, short cropped hair, a slight tilt in his head. Ethan believed it might be the same man who appeared in the porch window, photographed the one standing behind the Carver family just before they vanished. He placed the photos into a folder, sealed the satchel, and began the walk back down the ridge. His boots crunched over the dead leaves as he kept his eyes on the sloping ground, pausing occasionally to study fresh indentations in the soil. It had not rained in over a week. These were not recent prints. Still, they gave him the unsettling impression that someone had once paced this area with urgency. Back at the house, Ethan placed the folder beside the diary and the sealed bag from the underground room. He called the assistant district attorney and explained what he had found. She told him to return everything to the courthouse the next morning. When Ethan arrived, he was taken into a side office and met by 2 men from the State Bureau. They listened intently, took copies of the documents, and asked him to mark the ridge on a topographic map. By noon, a search team had mobilized. Forensic specialists and law enforcement officers accompanied Ethan back to the property. They walked together up the ridge in silence, the cold air cutting against their jackets. At the clearing, one of the forensic leads stepped into the root cellar and surveyed the scene. He returned moments later and nodded without a word. The excavation began 2 hours later. The area around the cellar and hunting blind was cordoned off. Flags marked points of interest. Dogs were brought in to detect scent. The sun began to fall behind the trees as the first shovel struck something beneath a layer of clay-rich soil. One of the deputies called for the team leader. Ethan stood several yards away, arms crossed tightly over his chest, barely breathing. Within 20 minutes, a small section of human remains was exposed. A femur, then a section of rib. The remains were brittle, but unmistakably human. The team worked with delicate precision, brushing away layers of earth with care. By the time darkness arrived, 2 shallow graves had been partially unearthed. Ethan sat on the porch of the farmhouse with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. A deputy handed him a cup of coffee. The lights from the crime scene illuminated the ridge in patches, casting long shadows between the trees. The forensic team continued to work through the night. By morning, they had recovered partial remains from 4 individuals. The anthropologist on site believed the victims were 2 adults and 2 children, based on bone structure and clothing fragments. Identification would require DNA testing. Ethan provided samples the next day. The district attorney assured him that the lab results would be expedited. 3 days passed. During that time, the area around the ridge was placed under state protection. A temporary shelter was set up to protect the site from weather. Media attention had begun to grow. A local reporter arrived at the farmhouse and asked if Ethan would comment. He declined, but noticed the presence of a black SUV parked just beyond the pasture. He saw it more than once, always in the same spot. No plates, no movement. On the 4th day, he walked toward it. As he approached, the vehicle pulled away in silence. The next morning, the district attorney called. The DNA tests had come back. 2 of the remains had matched Ethan's brother Mark and his wife Beth. The other 2 had not yet been conclusively identified, but they belonged to juveniles consistent with the ages of the Carver children. Further testing would follow. Ethan sat in his truck outside the courthouse for nearly an hour after that call. He watched the town move past the windshield in slow, disconnected motions. A mail carrier drove by. Children walked home from school. None of them knew that a buried truth had been pulled to the surface at last. Ethan returned to the farmhouse that evening with a new set of eyes. The porch boards creaked under his feet in a rhythm he now recognized. This had been a place of safety that became a place of betrayal. He walked through the house slowly, room by room. He paused in the children's bedroom. A small sticker still clung to the corner of the window. It was faded and peeled at the edge. A cartoon rabbit in overalls. It had probably been placed there by Abby or one of her siblings. He closed the door softly behind him. The following day, the state investigators expanded their search. A second team began examining the lower end of the pasture where a slight depression in the earth had been noted by one of the dogs. Within hours, a new site was flagged. This time, the remains appeared to be wrapped in canvas. Nearby lay a rusted pipe with dried stains and hair fragments. The crime scene report would later identify this as likely a murder weapon. The recovered bones belonged to a male child estimated to be between 6 and 8 years old. His left wrist still held a bracelet made of colored yarn. Ethan remembered helping Ruth Carver make bracelets one summer while babysitting. She had made one for each of her siblings. The bracelet on the wrist was yellow, blue, and green. It matched the colors Ruth had always chosen for Daisy. By the end of the week, investigators confirmed 6 individual sets of remains, all consistent with the Carver family. Ethan received the call in the early morning hours. He did not cry. He sat on the porch as the sun rose, holding the final report in one hand and Beth's diary in the other. The pages still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The words inside were no longer just memory. They were evidence. The family had not disappeared. They had been erased. The following Monday, Ethan sat across from Assistant District Attorney Karen Hoyt in a private room inside the Warren County Courthouse. She had a large binder on the table between them filled with statements, photographs, autopsy reports, and property records. Her expression was composed, but her voice carried weight when she spoke. She confirmed that all 6 members of the Carver family had been identified through dental records and DNA testing. The cause of death varied. Mark and Beth had suffered blunt force trauma. The children showed signs of asphyxiation. The positioning of the remains and the state of the burial sites suggested hurried concealment. Karen paused before saying the next part. The investigation had entered a new phase. They were treating it as a homicide case with evidence of a larger conspiracy tied to fraudulent land transfers, forged documentation, and obstruction by individuals formerly affiliated with both local government and private development interests. Ethan opened his own folder and slid a copy of the forged Carver deed across the table. He asked about the notary listed on the page, Judith Kemp. Karen nodded. The official state notary registry showed her signature on the deed, but the stamp used did not match her registered seal. Furthermore, her logs showed no entry for a meeting with either Mark or Beth. The date listed on the deed occurred after the family had already been reported missing. Judith died suddenly in 2004, shortly after her bank was acquired by a new financial institution. Ethan leaned forward and asked if the deed had been submitted by an attorney. Karen opened her binder and pulled out a scanned email. It showed that the document had been received through a law office in St. Charles representing Midlands Development. The name on the sender's line was Richard C. Davidson. Ethan knew that name. In 2005, Davidson had briefly appeared on local television as the spokesperson for a new regional project called Valley Reclamation. The plan had been shelved after local protests, but the promotional materials had listed several counties as target sites. Davidson had faded from the public eye after that, but Horizon Development Partners, the successor to Midlands, still listed him as a founding consultant. Karen said Davidson had since shifted into a quieter role in managing subsidiary ventures under different names. His current office address was in Columbia, Missouri. She informed Ethan that a subpoena was being prepared to request internal documents from all companies linked to Davidson. Investigators had also identified connections between Davidson and Randall Pierce, including overlapping service records conference attendance and shared involvement in land acquisition seminars across the Midwest. Ethan returned home that evening with a printed dossier in his passenger seat. The documents outlined the shell company's donation records and real estate deals tied to Davidson. At least 3 parcels in Warren County had been acquired through forged or questionable deeds. 2 of the families had since relocated out of state. One elderly landowner had died shortly after selling his property under pressure. The pattern became more familiar with each page: quiet meetings, unregistered visitors, disappearing evidence. Ethan stopped reading and stood at the kitchen sink staring out across the darkening fields. A cold wind had started blowing from the north, rustling the branches of the maple tree near the barn. He thought again of the man in the photograph behind the Carver family. He thought of the photographs found in the root cellar. Then he thought of the white SUV parked beyond the pasture just days ago. The next morning, Ethan drove to Columbia and parked outside the building listed in the development records. It was a modern structure with tinted windows and no visible signage. He entered the lobby and asked the receptionist if Richard Davidson was in. She looked up his name and told Ethan that Mr. Davidson was unavailable and did not accept walk-in appointments. Ethan thanked her and walked to the window. From there, he saw a black sedan pull into the parking lot. The driver stepped out in a gray suit and walked toward the side entrance. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was the same man from the porch photo, now older, but with the same bearing. He took out his phone and snapped a picture before the man disappeared inside. Ethan sent the photo to Karen with the caption, "This is him." She responded less than an hour later. The image matched a scanned ID badge found in a defunct personnel database. The name on the badge was Randall Pierce. His status showed terminated in 2006. No forwarding address was listed. His last known employer was Midlands Development Group. Karen informed Ethan that a warrant had just been issued to seize internal records from the building he had visited. She encouraged him to return home and avoid direct confrontation. State agents would be arriving in Columbia within the hour. Instead, Ethan drove back to Warren County. As he passed the edge of town, he turned onto a narrow gravel road leading to one of the parcels he had flagged earlier. It belonged to the Mallory family who had sold their land in 2004. The property had sat undeveloped for years. Rumor said they had been forced out after repeated visits from so-called zoning representatives. Ethan parked and walked the perimeter. A plastic stake still marked the corner of the lot. He knelt beside it and pulled out a small plastic tag buried in the dirt. The initials RP were etched in black ink. The tag matched ones found in development sites managed by Horizon. Ethan returned to the Carver farmhouse just before dusk. He opened the diary again and reread Beth's final entry. She had known they would not be safe. She had watched the ridge marked the paths and documented their steps. In her final act, she had hidden that diary beneath the barn, hoping someone might find it. The next morning, Ethan met Karen and her team at the courthouse. They showed him video footage obtained from a parking garage security camera in Columbia. It showed Pierce and Davidson entering the building the previous week. A second clip showed them exiting late in the evening carrying boxes. The timestamp was the same day Ethan had visited the site. The air was thick with overcast light when Ethan stood once again on the ridge where the Carvers had tried to hide. The trees held stillness in their branches and the grass bent low under the pressure of the morning mist. He had returned not for evidence and not for questions, but simply because something in him needed to stand in the place where everything had ended. The official work had moved into other hands now. State investigators continued their search through financial records and land deals. Warrants had been executed in Columbia. Davidson had been taken into custody without resistance. Randall Pierce had attempted to leave the state 2 days earlier, but was intercepted at a private airstrip outside Springfield. Both men were facing charges that included fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit homicide, and unlawful acquisition of property under duress. The Attorney General had issued a public statement calling the investigation one of the most disturbing breaches of public trust in the region's history. Ethan had not spoken to the press. He had turned down every request for interviews. What he wanted most was not attention, but acknowledgement for the dead and justice for the living. He looked down at the exposed ground where the makeshift graves had been uncovered. The dirt had been replaced with fresh soil, but the outlines remained visible to anyone who knew where to look. The Carvers had not simply been victims of greed. They had been selected. Mark had inherited the land from their father and expanded it with hard years of labor. Beth had planted every flower along the porch and stitched the curtains in every window. Their children had laughed in the yard and learned to ride bicycles along the gravel road. They were not numbers on a map or signatures on a deed. They were a family who believed their roots gave them protection and that their neighbors would stand with them. They had been wrong about the first and right about the second, only too late for it to matter. Ethan had finally come to understand that evil did not always wear the face of a stranger or arrive with sirens. Sometimes it moved in softly with polite smiles and quiet folders. Sometimes it built offices with glass windows and filed reports that looked clean on paper but smelled like rot when read aloud. The day before, Ethan had received the final file from the district attorney. It contained a handwritten confession from one of Davidson's assistants, a man who had remained silent for almost 20 years. The man had never been charged, but had carried the knowledge like a sickness. In his letter, he described being present during several meetings where Pierce detailed how the Carvers would be removed. He recalled Davidson giving direct orders to proceed once the family refused a final buyout offer. He had heard them use the word package when referring to the entire Carver household. He had watched from a parked car while Pierce and 2 hired men entered the Carver home on the night of the disappearance. The letter ended with a sentence that Ethan had reread 3 times without blinking. "I should have spoken sooner, but I thought silence would protect me. I did not realize it only protected them." The funeral service was held the following weekend at the town's largest church. Ethan had worked with the coroner and the Carvers' remaining relatives to arrange for proper burial plots at the edge of the old cemetery where their parents already rested. The weather was clear and the church was full. Farmers arrived with their hats pressed to their chests. Teachers came carrying framed photographs of the children in school plays and holiday concerts. The pastor delivered a short message about remembering what was lost and standing up for what remains. Ethan stood at the gravesite afterward with his mother, who had traveled in from Oklahoma. They watched together as each casket was lowered into the ground. Abby, Ruth, Daisy, Michael, Beth, Mark, the names were read aloud with care and finality. That night, Ethan returned to the farmhouse. He walked through the rooms one by one and left the lights off. The house did not feel haunted. It felt still. He entered the children's room and placed a small toy horse on the dresser. It was one he had found in the attic years earlier and kept tucked away. He left it without a word and stepped into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath him the same way it always had. The familiar noise grounded him more than it unsettled him. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and looked out the window over the sink. The barn door swayed slightly in the breeze. The same breeze that had carried so much silence over these fields for too many seasons. He sat down at the table where Beth had once written in her journal. He spread out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. He wrote not to the courts or the police or the press. He wrote to the Carvers. He told them everything had been uncovered. He told them the names were now known and the truth had begun to speak. He told them that their story would not be buried beneath legal terms and property lines. He told them their lives mattered and their resistance would never be forgotten. He folded the letter and placed it beside the diary in a wooden box he planned to donate to the County Historical Archive. He knew it was not enough. Nothing ever would be. But it was something. 2 weeks later, the Attorney General held a press conference announcing the indictment of 4 additional individuals linked to the land fraud scheme. The charges included perjury, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. The development firm had been permanently dissolved. An independent review board had been assigned to audit all land transactions from the past 25 years across the affected counties. A new initiative was introduced to protect family farms from predatory acquisition. Ethan had been invited to stand with the officials during the announcement. He had declined. Instead, he visited the Carver graves with a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the edge of the property. He placed them gently in the soil and stood for a long time with his hands in his pockets and his thoughts steady and full. The land remained untouched. The county had issued a preservation order that barred future construction. A small wooden sign now stood near the barn. It read, "In memory of the Carver family who stood their ground when it was hardest. Let no one forget." The letters were carved by Ethan himself and sealed by hand. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the porch light that had stayed on for weeks after the family disappeared. He remembered the note they left on the table. He remembered the hollow silence that followed. That silence had finally broken. It had broken not with rage or revenge, but with truth and witness. In the months that followed, Ethan returned often to the property. Sometimes he cleared brush or repaired the fence. Other times he simply walked the fields and listened to the wind. He found himself speaking less and hearing more. He had come to understand that justice did not mean closure. It meant clarity. It meant carrying the memory of those who could no longer speak. It meant standing in courtrooms and backyards and ridgelines and saying out loud what had once been whispered. They were here. They lived, they tried, they mattered. They should never have been forgotten. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more true story-inspired content. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Your voice helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them.